sanctions aren't expected to somehow magically change behavior. They're expected to make it more difficult and to frustrate the war effort. And also, they are not static. We have to continually work to tackle and block and continue. And most importantly, to try and get as many countries solidly behind this effort as possible.
The British government's Russian sanctions regime is falling to pieces. An investigation by The Times and Transparency International has found hundreds of millions of pounds worth of property being held by the family members of Kremlin cronies. It's emerged the 8-year-old daughter of one of Vladimir Putin's former regional governors owns a £2.3 million flat in London. More than 1,300 people have had their assets in the UK frozen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We can speak now to former US Deputy Assistant General of State and law professor Colleen Graffy. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
What does this tell us about Russian sanctions? Have they had enough of an impact?
Well, there's two things to understand about sanctions. The first is that sanctions aren't expected to somehow magically make Putin give up on attacking Ukraine. Their purpose is to make it more difficult and to frustrate the war effort. And secondly, sanctions aren't static. They must constantly morph as the Kremlin and associates seek to evade them. So the fact that the UK has discovered that Russian oligarchs have moved assets to family members, this should not be surprising. We're seeing the same thing in the United States. So the Treasury Office, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, has been constantly working at this and really constantly having to shift strategies because the oligarchs, Kremlin and associates are constantly finding new ways in which to try and skirt them. But nonetheless, the results have been pretty impressive because it's meant that, for example, the oil caps that the EU, the US, and others have put on Russian oil means that their oil revenues have been reduced, probably 60% lower than at the beginning, but Russian exports are rising. So this is a very clever attempt at allowing oil to come out of Russia so that we have energy security, but to cap the price so that Russia is not profiting from it and being able to continue at the same pace with their war effort.
It does make you think that this is just going to be a never-ending problem, isn't it? That if sanctions can just be circumvented in this way, that's going to continue to happen. So there needs to be continued effort on this.
Exactly. So they will continue to be skirted, and we will continue to block them. So, for example, now we have family members of Russian elites that have been designated because we've realized that they're passing it on to family members. We're including sectors like metals and mining and management consultants and aerospace and electronics, financial services, and also extending to companies that are working with Russians. So over 1,000 foreign companies have been reported, and they have stopped completely or curtailed operations with Russia. So the effects have been that I think 80% of Russian banking sectors are under U.S. sanctions, including the top 10 Russian-owned banks. And this just means it makes it that much harder for Russia to be able to continue the war effort. They have to turn to China. We're hoping, obviously, that China will not supply any weapons to Russia, but it puts Russia at a very weak position globally when they have to be going cap in hand to China, also going to Iran. And we're now putting sanctions on Iran and those that are creating these UAVs, drones. And so the fact that Russia has to turn to Iran and to North Korea puts Russia and Putin in a very vulnerable and weak appearance on the global stage.
Could you not argue the reverse is true, that by tightening sanctions on Russia, the country turns to the likes of China, Iran, North Korea, and relations are built there that perhaps otherwise wouldn't be?
Well, they were always there. So Russia was working closely with Iran previously. Russia has always ensured that they had a solid relationship with China, but it does make China worry about that relationship because supplying weapons to Russia would be contrary to international law because Russia is in the illegal position of using force against Ukraine, and China supplying Russia would, with arms and weapons, would put China in the crosshairs for sanctions and UN Security Council resolutions against China, which China does not want.
Ultimately, do sanctions actually work? What do they achieve?
They achieve a lot. They frustrate the war effort, they make it more difficult, and we're seeing now some uprising from the regions where Russia's not able to mobilize successfully within, they choose not to mobilize within Russia. They're mobilizing in the regions. And we're seeing various militia and volunteer groups in some of these areas, Chechnya, for example, and Bryansk region, where because of sanctions, because of pressures, because of show of weakness, these regions are beginning to say, why are we being treated this way? And in fact, one of the rallying cries is we need to be stopped being treated like slaves and rise up. Putin doesn't need this. It just adds one more angst to an already fraught and disastrous war.
There was this sense quite early on, with sanctions being announced, that it would result quite quickly in the collapse of the Russian economy. That hasn't happened.
I don't believe that anyone that knows and understands sanctions would say that. Maybe there was a hope that that would happen, but that's not the way sanctions work. Again, sanctions aren't expected to somehow magically change behavior. They're expected to make it more difficult and to frustrate the war effort. And also, they are not static. We have to continually work to block, tackle and block and continue. And most importantly, to try and get as many countries solidly behind this effort as possible. And the various UN Security Council and, not Security Council, General Assembly resolutions have been very effective in showing that the global support is with Ukraine and not with Russia.
Can we just look ahead to the steps that could be taken going forward? You've already mentioned a need to continue updating sanctions, to continue looking at sanctions. What further steps could be taken?
The next step, and this is already happening, is to freeze these assets and to find a way to use them in order to help rebuild Ukraine. There's difficulties with what's called sovereign immunity and how do we get access to these assets, but there are over 115 vessels, 19 aircraft, and every day we hear about another oligarch's yacht that has been possessed and is going to be used, hopefully, to help Ukraine rebuild after this is over.
We just reflect.
The other thing to look
Go
at
ahead.
is what is going to be happening in the courts in holding those that are waging this war of aggression, crime of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, to account, either courts in Ukraine or discussion of an international tribunal or a Ukrainian tribunal that would be internationalized in The Hague. So I think those are the next steps, looking at accountability and also looking at freezing and obtaining assets to help rebuild Ukraine.
Can we just look to another story of interest? We've been hearing the leader of a pro-Ukrainian Russian nationalist militia vowing to ride a German tank into Moscow and plant his movement's flag on the Kremlin towers. This is Denis Nikitin, a notorious former far-right football hooligan who heads the Russian Volunteer Corps. And he recently led about 40 of his troops into a Russian region which borders Ukraine. How much do we know about this figure and the group he runs?
Well, we know a bit, and we also know that this is a pattern where those in these regions are not appreciating the fact that they are the ones being mobilized. If you look at a map that shows where recruitment is happening. It's not in Moscow, it's not in St. Petersburg, it's in these regions. And they're being used basically as cannon fodder, along with Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group, who's emptied most of the prisons, and using these individuals to put in the front line. They're not trained, they have very little chance of survival. And these regions are being caught up in this and are resenting the fact that they are bearing the brunt of all of this, both economically and in human costs as well. Now, this individual, Denis Nikitin, is not a particularly freedom fighter as we would think of it, a football hooligan, a Russian nationalist, but he's also pro-Ukraine and is resentful of the Kremlin and what Putin is doing. He's anti-Putin. And again, this is the last thing that Putin needs, is to have various factions rising up against him and causing damage and difficulties in some of these areas. The area that he was involved in was, if I'm recalling correctly, Bryansk, and they had infiltrated 2 villages. So to have this on Russian soil is going to cause huge headaches for Putin.
And yet this, the Kremlin argues, proves their point about Ukraine and the problem of neo-Nazis and white nationalists in the region.
No, this individual is Russian, and he's from that region. He's not, that's as they're saying, just being used as an excuse. But if I were looking to the future of Russia, I would say that empowering these regions, building up civil society, the rule of law, to try and break the monopoly of Moscow, because who comes after Putin? I don't see how he can survive this, perhaps physically, but leadership-wise, it will be very difficult. Who comes after him? Perhaps the head of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, who will be equally as problematic for the world globally in continuing this crime of aggression against Ukraine. But if the regions were to try and create a decentralized Russia, there might be a different future for the region.
How likely is he to be successful in this bid to put our flag on the Kremlin, as he's claimed he wants to do, to ride in on a German tank?
I don't think he's going to get very far with his German Leopard 2 tank into Russia. But I think there will be some that will be rooting just because of trying to do anything to stop Putin. But I think that this is a sideshow, a problem for Putin, but not a serious one.
Colleen Graffy, great to have you on the programme. Thank you very much indeed. The US diplomat who served in the second Bush administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy for Europe and Eurasia.